Hi, ladies and gentlemen. It's Dr. Joel Hunter here, broadcasting live from a new studio. But I wanted to just welcome you and look forward to hanging out with you just briefly. Our agenda is pretty short, actually. We have three things we need to do. First thing I want to do is go over the first quiz with you. The second thing I want to do is go over the next quiz, give you some heads up on questions that are going to be on that. And then if some folks show up here, then we'll have Q&A. If not, that's fine. You can catch this stuff on the replay. So let me, I guess, dive right into the screen share part of this, where I'm going to give you my slides. And as people come in, if you have questions while I'm putting up the slides, you want to stop me, go ahead. And by the way, if you arrive, go ahead and say hi, because I want to make sure that I've got the audio set up like I promised I would do this time. So let's see here. Let me just double check. Okay, my audio is on, so I'm guessing there's a viewer who can hear me. Okay. And let me just see. Okay, that's all set. All right. Stand by for me, please, and I'll get the slides up. Okay. Great. All right, folks. So let's talk about what happened on that first quiz. The average was about a 75, so a little lower than I actually expected, given the stuff we went over in the first video, and then I gave you a couple questions and all, and I was really emphasizing a few things, but it didn't turn out that way. It's all right. We'll see if we can do better. I guess the big announcement is that I had decided to drop your lowest quiz. So that's a bit of good news, I think. And you will have then, an opportunity to make a mistake. Now, maybe for some of you, that was the first quiz that you were not happy with how that went. Okay, that might be it. But I hope what I can do with these videos as we meet each week is be able to address the things that are giving you difficulties, and so that you can not make the same kinds of mistakes, at least in the subsequent quizzes. Now, the content, of course, changes, so you have to know the content well enough to do well on the quizzes. But the techniques to get some of the answers correct anyway, to take on some of the questions, which if you haven't seen the first video yet, I really recommend that you do, because in that I talk about the different kinds of questions to look for, how to answer certain kinds of questions, and that's really, it takes a little practice, but you'll get it. One thing I would emphasize is that the section that I was really surprised gave you difficulties was the introduction, and I strongly encouraged you to read closely pages 9 through 15 that had to do with moral reasoning. So when I put up the slides, I've got a couple questions from that section that I want to go over with you just to reinforce some of those points. So let me see, have we got anybody here? If you're tuned in, could you give me a little shout so that I could see if I have my my audio on? Okay, maybe I didn't do it right again. Entirely possible, entirely likely. I'm going to turn up my volume all the way just to make sure. There we go. Okay, so now let me go over to the slides, and let's talk about that. So, yep. Okay, love that part where it goes off into infinity. Pretty awesome. Okay, so week 2, we're going to talk about how you did last week on the first quiz, and then the material that I want you to focus on for the second quiz. So the first thing to do then is lay out what we're going to cover. And I just mentioned that. Sorry, my voice is cracking because I've got a little cold, I think, and I haven't had a cold in a long time. But anyway, my throat's kind of scratchy. I'm going to take a little sip of water. Hold on. Here we go. That might help for 2 minutes. So we'll do the autopsy, and then we'll move on to the second quiz and preparing you for that, looking at those 2 chapters. And what I do, by the way, is I don't lecture on this material because that's not the nature of this class. It's an online class. So you're expected to be kind of a self-starter about learning the material. And I want to be able to guide you and sort of steer you into the sections that are going to be important for you to know, not only to understand the theory, but also because they will be things that I focus on in the quiz that you'll take. So that's why we're doing this, and that's why I'm not going to give you like a in-person lecture. I don't do that with this material. The advantage of this book, by the way, is that it's so accessible. So and of course you are always welcome to ask me a question like, okay, well, what's going on page 103? Can you explain this? And I'd be glad to answer those questions. So if I don't cover something that you want to understand better, by all means contact me and we'll get it straightened out. Okay, and then as time permits, we'll have a Q&A. Now, I've booked our time here. I planned our time to be an hour, but I really don't think it's going to take that long. I don't know that my voice will hold out that long, but we'll go as long as we need to within an hour. And so let's get started then. So just a refresher here that when you're taking the quiz, you can look at all the quiz questions at once, and there are 2 types of questions. So there's a set of questions that are designed to separate the wheat from the chaff. Those who've actually done a close reading, a sufficiently close reading, I should say, and those who haven't. And so those tend to be questions that I have drawn explicitly from the text. In other words, I'm quoting a significant part of the text. So, for example, when I say things like, according to the author, in one of the questions, more than likely that is, you'll be able to find the answer explicitly stated in the text. I may change some wording, but if you've read it closely, it'll be obvious what the answer is. So there are those questions that are basically the pass-fail kind of question. Then the other questions are what I call the inferential questions. The answers are available to you if you've understood the text, if you've thought about it, but they aren't explicitly on the page. So the questions here will be things like the argument question I gave you, and I'm going to actually look at that with you here today to go over that again. By the way, since I'm not hearing anyone, and I can't, and I have the screen share up, I can't see the feed and everything else that's going on with the Hangout. What you can do if you have a question at any point is drop it into the Q&A. If you open the Q&A app, put your question in there, and when I come back out of the screen share, I will answer your question. So if you are trying to talk and I'm not hearing you because I've messed up again, I guess, then write out your question in the Q&A and I'll take it. Okay, so let's move on to the autopsy. So this quiz was, like I said, was a little harder for many of you than I thought it would be. So I want to go through and just bring out a few questions that I thought were representative of what I would call the surprises to me, because I expected a little better performance on these particular questions, and they might illustrate something or give us an example of something that might be going on. So let's take a look at these 2 questions here. Now what I've done is I've just done a screenshot of the quiz results that I get. So I get these statistics, really sweet. So they tell me, how many people answered all the various answer choices. Well, let's look at this top one here. According to the author, good moral reasoning must what? And you're to select multiple answers here, all that apply. Now, if you notice, I'm going to use my cursor here. Hopefully you can see this. I should do something about that. So 85% of you chose consist of rigorous error-free logic, yes, and 95% of you chose avoid false beliefs. That's excellent. So that right there is good. Is a good job. What was surprising was how many of you chose. 40% of you chose that they must result in irrefutable moral truths. One of the things I discussed in the video was for any substantive philosophical claim, whether it's metaphysical, whether it's ethical, um, whether it's epistemological that has to do with knowledge, any substantive philosophical claim is is not going to be irrefutable. It's not going to meet that standard of evidence and knowledge. You There will always be contestable claims in good moral reasoning. That doesn't mean that the results of good moral reasoning aren't true. It doesn't mean that they don't consist of error-free logic. It just means there are contestable claims. And that's why you can never say that a substantive philosophical thesis results in irrefutable moral truths. And by a substantive a substantive philosophical thesis, I don't mean things like this, like the following. Here's an argument. It's a syllogism. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is immortal. That is a logical, error-free logic. It is valid, in other words. And the conclusion, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. It can't possibly be false. Okay, so that, however, that now what was the supposed moral or supposed truth that I learned there about reality? Well, it is that Socrates is immortal. Well, that's maybe interesting, but it's not what I would call a substantive philosophical thesis. So a substantive philosophical thesis would have to do with things like our normative theories that we're looking at in the book. And if one of those theories is true, that is a substantive truth. Okay, so that's what that means. But okay, so that's just a little explanation. But back to the answer choice there, result in irrefutable moral truth. I had explicitly called this one out and warned you about this one. All right, so let's look at the next one, and then I'm going to make a claim about both of these. That's why I put them together. So the next one is all moral claims are equally true, and their truth is up to the individual if we do not have a perfectly reliable test for truth. So this is a hypothetical claim. It's got that if. All right, so you could actually reverse it. So here, let me reread it now and put it in with the if leading. If we do not have a perfectly reliable test for truth, then all moral claims are equally true, and their truth is up to the individual. Okay. So in your text, I believe it's page 15. This is one of those explicit questions, and it's one that I warned you about in the first video, and I told you this was false. That demand for a perfectly reliable test for truth is an unreachable demand, and it does not help us make sense of some sort of very basic moral beliefs that most people have, and that they take as true kind of by default without even thinking about it. For example, that you ought to act compassionately when you can, which we're going to get to today. You ought to act compassionately when you can. All right, so is there a perfectly reliable test for that? The truth of that claim? No, there's not. Does that mean that claim is as equally true as compassion is not really that important? And the truth of whether compassion is important or not is just up to the individual. It doesn't entail. The fact that there is not a perfectly reliable test for the truth of that claim does not require that all claims are morally true. If moral claims are equally true, or if claims are moral claims, the truth of them is up to the individual, that's an independent question. Okay? So it does not have to do with whether or not there's a perfectly reliable test for truth. This is a similar kind of claim to the kind of claim where somebody might point out, oh my gosh, we're looking at like, 10 moral theories here, 10 moral theories. The very fact that there are multiple moral theories seems to weigh against the fact that one of them could be true. But that's a confusion. That's not logically sound thinking. The fact that there are multiple candidates, say multiple options, that does not mean that they're either relative or that that they're equally true. So you just recognize the logic in there, and your author does a really good job of explaining this. Okay, so the general point I want to make about these two questions is that I think everybody, and I mean everybody, should review pages 9 through 15 in the introduction. It's so important. And these kinds of questions will come back in different forms in future quizzes. So you really need to internalize that part of the introduction to do a successful performance on the future quizzes. Sorry, my head is kind of in a fog. I am, I'm not even on meds, but my thinking is not very clear today. Sorry about that if I'm rambling. I try to be brief here. Okay, so again, the introduction is where you'll find the answers to these questions, pages 10 and pages 15 for those. Okay, next. Okay, so here I give you, what I tell you is a valid argument. So it is. And the gist of the argument is that only theists, that is, people who believe in God, are properly natural law theorists. So that means that while there might be people who aren't theists who claim to be natural law theorists, they aren't properly so. Only theists are supposed to be. That's what this argument purports to show. Okay? And it's valid, so the conclusion follows from the premises. Now, here's the question, though. This argument either supports or opposes the author's contention that not all natural law theorists are theists. So he does make this claim. Actually in a couple places, page 77, and also he revisits this when he's talking about human nature on pages 83 through 84. And there he makes it quite clear that while natural law theory has been popularized by theists for almost 1,500 years, it is not limited to theists. Now, I'm thinking that because so many of you got this wrong, there's, I think, two issues here. One is, or three issues. One is close reading. And issue two would be that you didn't review the video. Issue three would be maybe you didn't read the question carefully. And so one little lesson that I want you to take from this one in particular is make sure that you read the question carefully. You notice that I circled with a red circle that not. So if you read this without the not, then I can understand why you would say supports, because that would be correct. But the fact that the not is there, the author's contention, this argument does not support the author's contention. It opposes the author's contention that not all natural theorists are theists. Okay? So he does, in fact, make that claim. He does contend that not all natural law theorists are theists. Okay? So the argument above, which purports to claim that only theists are natural law theorists, has then to oppose that contention of the authors. Okay? So I don't know if it's just sort of forgetting the argument and what the argument showed, or whether it was just not close reading. So I guess there's four issues there. But the three issues are, that final issue is not reading the question closely. It could be missing the not, or it could be just sort of forgetting the argument that came before. All right, next. Okay, now we're moving to another one, and this one was really surprising. Was it really? Yeah, I guess it was really surprising to me, because I was reviewing this section on page 79 where the author talks about the empirical truths and conceptual truths and the differences between them. Sorry, I need some water. So I give you this crazy claim that it's wrong to engage in the recreational slaughter of another human being. According to natural law theory, and I emphasize that with the italics, what does natural law theory say about the truth of that claim? How is it to be? What kind of truth is it? Is it a consensual truth, like all bachelors are unmarried males? Um, a triangle, triangle is three-sided figure, that kind of thing? Or is it empirical? In other words, it's with the evidence of the senses that we know this. Okay, on page 79, the author makes it quite clear that according to natural law theory, all moral claims, natural law theorists believe that they are empirical, or their truth of them can be determined empirically. So that is why the answer there is empirical. Um, so interesting that 60% of you chose neither conceptual nor empirical. I'm not quite sure why that would be, but since it is a moral claim, then that is what natural law theorists would say, that if it's true that it's wrong to engage in recreational slaughter of another human being, if true, is an empirical truth. Okay? Yes. Here's the question that I actually gave you in the first hangout we did. So I gave you this argument, and I talked about, please do review that, about how to analyze an argument, how you check for validity, and then you isolate each premise and ask if it's true. So in this one, the analysis says that since natural law theorists accept the truth of premises 1 through 3, they must accept that the conclusion 4 is also true. Why is this a poor analysis of the argument? Well, one possibility is that it's invalid, but it's not invalid. The conclusion follows from the premises, and so that strikes off the answer choice down here. I think it was D. In the video, I went through the first premise when we were isolating each premise. Since humans are animals, it's in our nature to behave in some respects as other animals do. Okay, so we covered that one, and we eliminated that we tested that for its truth, and that's a true statement, or it's certainly plausibly true, likely true. No obvious reason to question that one. The second claim, though, however, is all animal behavior, because it is natural, is morally acceptable. Okay, the issue here is that as your text says in this, like the second page of the chapter, only moral agents can have what we would call morally acceptable or morally unacceptable behavior. Only moral agents can be held responsible for their actions, and natural law theorists believe that, well, that's humans, that's not animals. Okay, so that connection of, going back here, that all animal behavior, because it's natural, is morally acceptable, that connects animal behavior to being morally acceptable, which natural theorists do not hold. Okay, so that's right there is why this is not a good analysis. Natural law theorists do not accept the the truth of premise 2. Okay, and then some of you, so actually the majority of you chose that one out of the answer choices, but many of you did not. And then so premise 1, if you had seen the video, you know that one wasn't true. And then premise 3, some animals kill or eat their own young. Well, that's true. That's there are examples that you can give of that, which do not come to my mind right away, but I know that they are. And certainly in desperate circumstances, animals will do that. But some do it just as a part of their natural behaviors. Okay, so back to this. Then you have if you missed this one, you didn't get that the importance of the moral agent. And I want to emphasize this one too, because moral agency is going to be very important going forward in consequentialism, and especially in Kantianism, in social contract theory. When we get into those, moral agency is super, super important, because this has to do with who is a member of the moral community. So for natural law theorists, it's not obvious that anything, anyone, or sorry, any species other than humans would be a part of the moral community. They would have to demonstrate some form of rationality. Um, but the moral community and other normative theories will be different. So you have to understand this concept of moral agency. All right. Number next, um, you have two um, you have two arguments here that I asked you about. The natural law argument from humanity, and this had to do with definitions. This too I covered in the first video and kind of hammered this one actually. So really surprised that you missed this one. But the answer is on page 89. It's in really the final paragraph of the chapter, right before the conclusion, where your author talks about that while definitions are of no use in settling moral problems, we can't define moral concepts away, just to make the problem go away. So we can't, use eclectic definitions and game the system. But definitions are extraordinarily important for us to figure out, okay, what is really the problem here? Let's define some key terms. And we saw this in this chapter, particularly over the concept of human nature. And so even talking about things like, action A being natural or unnatural, there's built-in ambiguity to that, and a lot of arguments that use that, and he gave you some examples of that, will equivocate on the meaning of natural because it admits of more than one meaning. So anyway, the definitions, it's very important to have definitions. They are very useful in moral reasoning, but not for solving problems, but for clarifying the issues of what really is at stake. Okay. Whew. All right. So that was your first autopsy, and I hope that was helpful. It gives you, I think one thing I like about it is that it gives you a chance to look back at, actually, let me come back and see if there's any questions. Sorry. Okay. Here we are. So I'm going to pull up the Q&A real quick and see if there's any questions about any of those. Questions. I see no questions. Okay, so you guys are hanging in there. Great. Let me move on then to the, the quiz 2 prep. And let me get a drink first. All right. Nope, not the showcase, kids. The screen share. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. There we go. Oh. One thing I was noticing from the recording of the first video is how annoying my mouse click was. So I decided I was not going to do that. And I'm touchpad challenged. So there we go. All right. So let's talk about quiz 2. We're talking about egoism. Egoism is probably a default moral position for a lot of people. It'll sound very familiar. You will probably recognize arguments that you've had with people who kind of assume that egoism is true. It seems obviously true to proponents of egoism. But in your text, you have 2 different chapters, and the ethical egoism, which is the moral theory about what we ought to do, what we ought not to do, is preceded by psychological egoism, which is explaining human motivation. What are our motives for our actions and choices? And so this, because it's a theory of psychology, is a descriptive theory. Okay, so it's at the level of fact. It's either factually correct or incorrect, partially correct or partially incorrect. That is psychological egoism. We're going to talk about that, and then the second chapter. Chapter 8, that would be, is ethical egoism. So it's built on psychological egoism. It takes psychological egoism as true, and from that derives then what we're morally required to do and what we're morally forbidden to do. So the technical name for that then is it's a prescriptive theory. Think prescription. That what is a prescription that your doctor gives you? It's like, here, you go take this. So it's instructions to go do something, and so that's what our normative theories are. They're prescriptive. So the psychological egoism is trying to describe reality. That is giving a theory about what's going on in the human mind. Okay, enough about that. So in psychological egoism, the key term, the key idea is self-interest. According to psychological egoism, there is only one thing and one thing only that motivates all of our decisions, all of our actions, and that is self-interest. The corollary to this, the counterpart to this, is then, well, if that's true, then there's no such thing as altruism. And you'll hear this is where you will usually pick up whether someone is an egoist or not. Is you'll hear them say things like, well, people who are compassionate or do kind things, they're like they're just trying to soothe their guilty conscience. So that's for themselves. It's to make themselves feel better, right? That actions that appear to be other regarding rather than self-regarding are still, there's a hidden motive there of self-interest. Maybe it has to do with the expected benefit of helping somebody out will come back to me, right? Or that maybe there's some sort of competitive advantage that I have for being compassionate over this one thing or kind about one thing in the moment, because I'm expecting something beneficial, or I'm trying to avoid something that's going to be harmful to me, that will make me miserable. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit in the chapter to page 97, really, where the highlighted text, begging the question, appears. This is a really important concept in logic and informal reasoning. And what happens, sorry, not necessarily informal reasoning, but all reasoning. And you hear this phrase a lot. Well, that just begs the question. And when people say it, they often mean something quite different than what it actually means in logic. And so this is really important to get, and he discusses it as he's doing an analysis of the argument from our strongest desires. And what begging the question actually means is that you're stating a premise in an argument that assumes already that the conclusion is true. Okay, but that's the problem is that what the premise is supposed to do is establish and show that the conclusion is true, rather than depend on the conclusion to be true in advance. So that's called begging the question. And here, author illustrates this in his analysis of the argument from our strongest desires. So you'll want to know what begging the question is, because there is a question about that. So look carefully at his definition, and then the argument from strongest desires. There's a question there. So let me come back now to psychological egoism, and the definition is going to be on page 94. So it's right there in the middle in italics. I'll just read it to you. All human actions are aimed at avoiding some personal loss or gaining some personal benefit, or both, either in the short run or in the long term, or both. So you see how this covers both the benefits and losses. Okay, so things that are beneficial versus things that are harmful, and it also allows that this could be over different spans of time. So it could take time for this to occur. So it could be short duration, could be long duration. All right. Then let's look at the implications of egoism argument. This is really important because he will, in this argument on page 95, which is just right off the definition, he shows how, if psychological egoism is true, then how our ethical response, what our ethical response is to it if it's true. And so the point of this one, however, is to focus on altruism and how in psychological egoism, altruism is impossible. So if an action is impossible for you, in other words, if you think that you're acting in a way that's other regarding, let's say you're going to be a hero, right, and you're going to go rescue somebody who's drowning, um, the psychological egoist then is committed to the fact that you're putting your life at risk, um, is not other regarding. You're not being altruistic. You're not being heroic or oh, you could be conventionally, but you're not really acting out of that motivation. At some point you are acting. At some point in your psyche, you are acting in your own self-interest by what other people might regard as heroic. And so the argument here is to show just um, how extreme, I guess you could put it that way, the psychological egoist position is. So because it's denying that there's any such thing as altruistic action, which seems to run counter to kind of common sense and experience that it seems that people often do. But that's nevertheless the claim. And the important point here is that if psychological egoism is true, then that means not just that altruism is impossible, but that you do not have a duty to act altruistically. Easy for me to say. You have no duty to act in ways that are other regarding. You only, as it turns out in ethical egoism, have a duty to act in your own regard. In other words, in your own self-interest. So, by denying that altruism exists, that takes away then our duty to act in ways that are altruistic, that are not for our personal benefit, that are at all times trying to avoid personal loss. Okay, so that's the implications argument. So have a look at that, please. And then the strictly conscientious action is a key term. This is one of those bolded terms. It's on page 96, and this is you could call this another name for altruism, but but it's actually even harder. It's harder for the egoist to respond to. Um, the idea here is that you are strictly conscientious action is one where you're doing what you think is required of you. In other words, some duty you feel that you have, even in the face of temptation not to do it. So, in other words, what it's trying to do is trying to pull apart the uh, the motivation that desire gives us, because egoism will often say that, look, what you're doing when you are pursuing what's in your self-interest is you're going to be acting on your desires. You're going to be acting on your strongest desires, in fact. Okay, so strictly conscientious action is a counterexample to that belief of the egoist. And what it does is it tries to separate, the desire from the self-interest by showing that, well, look, sometimes we feel and then act on certain duties that we have, in spite of a strong desire not to do them. And your author goes through examples of that. Okay, so there you go. That is the that section. Then moving on to a couple other arguments, which I've kind of touched on. They just flesh out the theory of psychological egoism. There's an argument from expected benefit, and it's very similar to the argument from avoiding misery. So this pages 97 through 101. It's kind of right in the middle of your text. And then the last point I wanted to bring out to you was near the end. So I'm skipping over a little bit that I do not have, I don't have a lot of questions on, but there is a section on evidence that I think is important to understand here, because if the psychological egoist is correct, remember, this is a descriptive theory, so it's something that admits of scientific testing. So we should be able to look for evidence that it's true. And so we need to know, well, what kind of evidence can we test for? And on page 102, your author talks about this evidence from the realm of self-interest. And there are two. One is testimony, In other words, it is your own your your own statement about what your motives are, and the other is your behavior. What you actually do. Those are the two areas of evidence that one could test to see whether psychological egoism is true or not. Okay, so moving on to ethical egoism. And now this is the normative theory. It is prescriptive, and the definition of it is on page 107. So I'll just read that. It's in italics, right in just below halfway. If ethical egoism is true, I'm sorry, let me back up. This sort of egoism claims that actions are morally right just because they best promote one's self-interest. It's kind of obvious that that is what psychological egoism is claiming as well, with the additional component of a statement about what is right and what is wrong. Okay, that's what makes it an ethical theory. So let's look at then the an important part here, the argument from paradigmatic cases, because once you're confronted with a lot of examples of where it seems that egoism is clearly false, where it seems like altruism um, most certainly does exist, and that people do actually are sometimes actually motivated by other regarding reasons. um, the chapter starts kind of unusually, because what he does is he raises sort of that uh, first argument as one that is opposed to ethical egoism. So that's what the argument from paradigmatic cases is, and he goes through an analysis of that on the next 2 pages. But the takeaway point from this section is that ethical egoism sometimes requires that um, that you do certain actions that seem highly immoral, or at least immoral conventionally, where we take things like, lie, cheat, and steal as things you shouldn't do, conventional morality, right? Um, Sometimes ethical egoism requires you to do those things because why? It's in your self-interest in certain, if the conditions are such that it is in your self-interest, that you might not only be morally permitted to lie, cheat, or steal, but you're morally required to lie, cheat, or steal. It's a very strong claim. So do have a look at that. Um, then I'm kind of skipping over the what was it? The Oh yes, the self-reliance argument. That's fine, because it really, self-reliance argument kind of blends into, I think, the libertarian argument. So you can look at that. Um, and it's pages 111 through 112. So a key point in this is to look at, this is, by the way, these are defenses of ethical egoism. So there's a libertarian defense of ethical egoism, and what it does is it adds these concepts to where our duties come from. So we know that we have a duty to do what's in our self-interest, right? Always do what's in our self-interest. But libertarians also say that these duties arise from either consent or reparation. Now, what that means is that they are you see, if you have a duty to help other people, then it is only because you have agreed to do that. That's the consent part. You have voluntarily accepted that duty, or you have violated someone's rights, and so you owe a duty to repair that damage that you've done. Okay, so that's what they say. The libertarian would say, the libertarian defense of ethical egoism would say is the source of your duties to help other people. Okay, but as your author shows, this doesn't work for ethical egoism, because there's the only duty is, what it does is it adds another source to your moral duties, whereas ethical egoism doesn't recognize that. They only recognize that source being one's own self-interest. Okay, um, their egoist, an ethical egoist, has to deny that there are other sources other than your self-interest for your moral duties. Okay. So then the question then of helping others, your duty to help others, that only comes into play for the ethical egoist if not out of consent or reparation, but if it is in your self-interest to help the other person. Okay. Lastly, there are the three problems for ethical egoism, according to your author. I'm skipping over what he calls the best argument for ethical egoism. Do have a look at it, but I don't have any questions from that. So ask the perennial question, which is why be moral. It's a really great section. But what I do on the quiz is do ask you what are the three problems confronting ethical egoism. So do have a look at that. Know what those are, what he considers to be the most serious problems for ethical egoism. Okay, and now we can have some question answer. I can answer questions about stuff on quiz 1, stuff I cover here quiz 2, in a flash, or anything else going on in the class that you want to talk about. I'd be glad to take those questions now. Let me come back and get out of the screen share if I can. Stop screen sharing. There we go. And we're back. Excellent. Okay. Well, let me look in the queue here. Looks like my folks have tuned and gone on. That's fine. But no questions in the queue. So I am going to sign off. And I want to thank you for checking it out. For those of you who managed to check in real quick, and if you didn't, I'd like to really to know from you if there's anything that I can do on my end to make sure that you're able to participate in these hangouts, because I really want to make them available to as many people as I can. I think having some interaction would help. And if you have suggestions for other things that you would like to cover in a hangout, I'd be glad to take that as well. So I guess with that, I'm going to say good night and good luck on quiz number 2. And see if there was anything else that I wanted to tell you before I go. This is Hunter getting probably just kind of fading out from the head cold, but I think I've covered everything that I wanted to cover with you. I wanted to make sure that everybody had opportunity to tune in if you could. If I can make this easier for you, I would love to do that. So any suggestions you have, I would love to hear them. And other than that, I'll be seeing you next week. Take care and good luck on the quiz.